Football season may be over, and soccer and baseball season has not started yet, but there is still a lot to talk about in terms of sports in the great state of Ohio. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Buckeye Sports Breakdown. I'm Mahirson Hassan, and let's get to it. Today, I check in on college basketball teams, including some action, and also talk about the Blue Jackets as they embark on a road trip, which includes a stop right here in Phoenix. But first, let's take a look at the quick hits. The University of Cincinnati Bearcats collapsed 75-71 Wednesday on the road at Eastern Carolina, blowing what was at one point a 15-point lead early in the second half, and mostly had a double-digit lead throughout the second half of that game. Overall, kind of sums up UC's season. They've had some bright spots here and there, but when you look at the results and more importantly, how they've played down the stretch, we saw it against Houston a couple weeks back. They just lost it in the end. Kind of the story of their season, and overall, very, very minimal chances of making the big dance this year. University of Dayton, the Flyers, play Loyola tonight at 7 Eastern. They're currently in a three-way tie for second in the conference, but they would currently be at a 4th seed. So just to clarify, you have St. Louis and Fordham, who are also 9-4 in the conference. However, Fordham does have a better overall record, and then St. Louis also has just better competition compared to Dayton. Of course, despite there being ties and stuff in conference, and that too playing a role, especially when we get to the tournaments that will be coming up pretty soon, actually. If I'm not mistaken, about, I would say 3 weeks from now, that's going to pay dividends down the stretch, especially when you're playing teams that have a higher level, when you're looking at the quad 1, quad 2 type wins. We'll talk about that later in the show when we talk about the MACtion teams, the teams in the MAC. But nonetheless, very important down the stretch. And last but not least in the quick hits, Jonathan Gannon has been hired as the Arizona Cardinals' new head coach. More importantly, for Bengals fans, Lou Anarumo is staying in Cincinnati. There was a lot of talk between who was going to be hired. Anarumo was ideally the second choice for Arizona. They ended up picking Gannon as their head coach. And I think it shows for the Bengals, you have your two coordinators back, and more importantly, the future is still bright. You're still in the golden age of Bengal football and still looking for a chance to hopefully one day hoist a Lombardi trophy. I look at the Eagles especially. Props to them. Played a great game in the Super Bowl, but Shane Steichen's now head coach of the Colts, and Gannon's now head coach of the Cardinals. So Nick Sirianni has essentially lost the two coordinators that has made this Eagles team very great. And now they have to kind of start rebuilding. Despite them having the good pieces, they don't have the coaches to necessarily help them out. For the Bengals, they don't technically need to do that since they already got their pieces. Let's take a look at college basketball today, and we'll talk about Xavier first. For the first time this year, if I'm not mistaken, again, I'd have to check that, but for the first time this year, Xavier has dropped 2 consecutive games. First to Butler, which was last Friday, and then on Wednesday, lost to Marquette on the road, both of which were in the span of about, it was pretty close, within 2 points. That was how close this game was, folks. I'm just looking at Xavier's schedule. This is actually, pardon me, this is the second time this year that Xavier has dropped, but this is the first time in conference that this has happened. Earlier this year, when they were playing in the PK 80 tournament, they ended up losing to Duke and then to Gonzaga right after. Again, much different competition. Despite Duke and Gonzaga not playing at their highest potential this season, they are still pretty big blue blood programs. Marquette and Butler, not so much. And I think for Marquette too, with that result, it does put them in a pretty good standing in the Big East, 13-3, and Xavier currently in a three-way tie with Providence and Creighton. As I mentioned before, I'll be referring to this a lot throughout the episode, but the last time I talked college basketball, I remember doing the red, yellow, and green and indicating the chances of each team in Ohio of making it to March Madness. And I had Xavier at a green, and I said, unless they ended up pulling a piece of baloney, they're going to make it. It's almost evident right now that they are going to make it. 2.5 games above Seton Hall, who is 9-7 in the conference, 16-11 overall. Xavier currently 19-7. You also look at it too, despite tying Providence and Creighton, they are still above both of them. If the tournament, that is the Big East tournament, were to start today, Xavier would be a second seed. So overall, not too bad. Pretty good standing for them. Should be making March Madness overall. Let's go back to the game on Wednesday. I watched majority of it. Now, I didn't see how Xavier blew their lead, but simply put, they lost a big lead again. We saw this against UConn a few weeks back as well. They have a good start, but then they lose it early on, and then it kind of bites you in the back, especially when you're playing on the road in a raucous environment. It was the case at UConn and Stores, and it was also the case with Marquette and Milwaukee, where once that home crowd gets going, there's not much of stopping them unless you just play out of your mind. And we've seen Xavier do that. We saw them do that against UConn, and they did it in times against Marquette. Now their defense, granted, did play well. Sean Miller's teams throughout the years have done a great job on defense. However, the offensive part, I didn't really like more than the offense. I think Soleil Boom was still a good sharpshooter. I have never seen in my time watching college basketball, granted not as much as other people, but I have never seen anybody be super clutch when it comes to shooting the ball as Soleil Boom. Now we'll get to his flaws later. Actually, we'll get to his flaws now. Granted, he did miss a potential game winner against Butler. Granted, he did have a lot of turnovers and lost the ball a lot in the game against Marquette, one of which led to a turnover, made it a one-possession game, and then Marquette ended up getting the win. Simply put as that, I think in that regards too, Xavier shot themselves in the foot on Wednesday. You cannot have that many turnovers in that big of a situation. And the other thing about that too is Marquette was not pressuring that much. It was simply losing the ball when you're simply resetting and going up the court, not in a counter, not in anything else. It's in the simple actions unto itself. And if I were Sean Miller, I'd say it's simple as that. It's simply the basics, and Xavier's got to do it right. That's the problem. One other point I was thinking about was this is now the fourth game that Xavier has not had Zach Freemantle. Again, I can check when we could see a timeline and when Zach Freemantle could return. But more importantly, Xavier started out 2-0 when he was not there. The report was in late. But going back to my point, Zach Freemantle, without him, first they went 2-0. Now they have 2 losses. And I said before, within 2 points. It's not a good look for Xavier when you have a lot of these games. And especially, I think, going down the stretch on memory lane for Xavier, how many games they've played close, right? Ohio State in 2007, the Bronson Koenig game, even against Florida State in 2018. There's so many moments you can bring back for Xavier where they played in close games. And sometimes they came out victorious. I mean, keep in mind that one time they went to the Elite Eight, they ended up beating Arizona at the time, coached by Sean Miller. That kind of says something unto itself as well. But you get my point. Xavier's had so many close games that they could have won, but they didn't at big stages. And I think, you could say that it's good that it's happening now and not in March, but at the same time, you've got to clean it up for there to be a difference. It's simply put as that. You got DePaul and Villanova this upcoming stretch of time before I check back in with you guys next Friday, which is when the Muskies will face Seton Hall. Looking at Ohio State now. Ohio State has also been rough. Yeah, it was when I did the updates on their chances. I had Ohio State at a yellow. Now they are severely red, where they were in that stretch of time where they could have gotten wins, and they did. It almost sounds like a broken record when you look at Ohio State in the Big Ten. Not so good. 3-12 in the conference, 11-15 overall, lost 5 straight, and they're currently 5 games behind Rutgers, who's currently 8th in the Big Ten. To preface, right now, at least this was the case last night. I can check bracketology this morning, but Big Ten ended up having about 8 spots in the bracket. I can check where the teams line up now. That has been now up to 9 teams in the bracket. But you also have an Ohio State team that has not played well in the bracket, and it shows when you look at the standings this year. Also, not to mention, they did lose to Iowa on the road yesterday, 92-75. Simply put, you cannot allow someone like Iowa too. Meanwhile, keep that in mind. Iowa to score 92 points. So OSU is currently second to last. Minnesota is the only team behind them, and that too, Minnesota has 2 games in hand in terms of conference play. So again, Ohio State will have to turn things around. Rutgers is 8th. Michigan is at 9 right now. And they're also 5 games ahead of Ohio State, 8-7 in the conference. So simply put, Ohio State, just to get into that spot of maybe being in Lenardi's, whether it's one of these 16 middle, last 4 buys, last 4 in, first 4 out, next 4 out, they're going to have to pull a miracle. It's simply put as that. You're going to have some true guts down the stretch. And I think we're going to find out if they have those guts this weekend when they head to Purdue. That one will be at 1 p.m. on Sunday. And let's keep in mind, Purdue has also had a little bit of a fall from power per se. They're still in a number 1 seed according to Lenardi, but you think about it, this is a team that lost to Northwestern, lost to Maryland, that too, 2 consecutive losses, 3 losses in the last 4 games. Granted, they have not lost at home this year, all of those losses coming on the road. But this is an Ohio State team that has played confident so far, at least against Purdue. And we saw that the last time those two played off as the Boilermakers ran away from Columbus with just a 2-point victory, to be honest with you, 71-69. And even in that game overall, Ohio State had command in that. They were up at half, and that too in the first half, they were up by a majority of 9 points. Then you get to the second half, and again, the Buckeyes kept on rolling for the meanwhile. It was a neck and neck type of game. So I think for the Buckeyes, despite having troubles on the road this year, you have to kind of block out the noise of Mackey and really focus in on what's happening. You think about it, and if I were the coach, I would say the exact same thing. You've played with this team before. We can do it again. We just need to change a few things. Don't let the confidence, or rather the lack of confidence, get into your head. Because if Ohio State can prove they're a March Madness team and they can make a run in the Big Ten tournament, which along with this miracle in the regular season is probably what they will need if they want to hear their name called on Selection Sunday, they are going to have to pick up this win. It's almost similar to what we saw with Houston when they played UC. Interestingly enough, Houston at the time was a number 3 seed. Purdue is a number 3 seed. That is number 3 seed in the overall rankings, not number 3 seed in March Madness. But nonetheless, you look at that game, UC had the command. Houston didn't. Remember, they were coming off a surprise loss to Temple at home. I mean, you never know when Temple, out of all people, is going to show up on the big stage. But boy, did they. And UC almost replicated that as well. And it kind of gives a little sliver of hope to Ohio State. Even though the Bearcats did not win that game, very similar to OSU in other situations, they had a substantial lead and then lost it at the end. Simply put, finish the game out. It's kind of what we've seen for all of these teams. UC, Ohio State, Xavier, all of which have lost big leads and in turn have lost the game. And they're going to have to change that up. All right. So going into this weekend, I mentioned this being, I'll be honest with you. My 2 favorite sports are football and soccer. And this is the first weekend in a while neither one is going to be on. That is, when I say soccer, I mean MLS soccer. I do love European football, but I got my love for the United States. But nonetheless, when you look at the types of action happening this weekend, I'm actually more hyped for Maction. All these games in the MAC that are happening this weekend and on Tuesday will be something special, especially for that conference that is kind of a toss-up. Honestly, there were three teams, a couple weeks ago that I was like, these are the contenders, and Ball State has also stuck their head in to potentially get that championship. Granted, you will have a tournament after this, but just to have that supremacy overall of being a number one seed, just to win the regular season title as well, does mean something for both of those sides. So let's take a look at the standings. Currently for the MAC, as I was talking about a couple weeks ago, I gave the yellow sign to Kent State, Toledo, and Akron. At the time, they were at a three-way tie for first. That has changed slightly a little bit. Kent State and Toledo are now tied at first. Kent State, fresh off their wins and because of net rankings, do have the number one spot currently. They're also in the top 75 right now with the 56. More on how that is important later on in the broadcast. Where you have Toledo in second, Ball State and Akron are currently tied for second, 10-3 in the conference, while they're a game behind Kent State and Toledo. And Ball State is currently third, Akron is fourth. Those two are 3 games ahead of Ohio and Northern Illinois, which kind of makes up the second tier of the MAC. So it's pretty obvious it's going to be these top 4, Kent State, Toledo, Ball State, and Akron, to decide who gets it. And I think it kind of baffles me a little bit to note the idea of the top 4, where the number one seed, contrary to what I talked about last week, where I kind of gave an example to GCL volleyball on exactly how things move and how important that number one seed is. By the way, I will have a podcast coming out in a few weeks with Elliot Scully that deals with boys volleyball in Ohio. So more on that later. You'll see some announcements on the socials when we get closer to that time. But nonetheless, back to the Maction. Big games on Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. Kent State heads to Muncie to take on Ball State, and then a little matchup in the state of Ohio. Akron heading to Toledo. So looking at those two games, Toledo beat Akron on the road by 10 points. That was also 10 days ago. Kent State beat Ball State by 21 back at their home stadium. That was about a month ago. So again, things have changed, specifically more for Ball State than it has for Kent State. Now, when you look at basketball in general, and if you talk to anybody that follows college basketball a lot, I mean, I almost hear Nicholas Haddell here at ASU talk about it every week. The idea of quad wins, quad 1, quad 2, quad 3, and quad 4. For most of these MAC teams, their focus is mainly in the quad 3 and quad 4 sections. That's the reason why Kent State is currently at a 56 right now compared to Toledo, compared to Akron and Ball State. It's quite a massive gap, I'd actually say. Kent State, they're the highest in the MAC in terms of rankings at 56. Toledo is 96. They are second in the MAC. And I bring this up for one reason and one reason only, is it plays a big dividend into anybody that could get an at-large bid. Most likely, and I would guess this would probably be the case, that whoever wins that MAC championship in Cleveland will end up going to the big dance. Nobody else gets in. But there could be one exception to that, and that is if Akron ends up winning out. You take a look at the Zip schedule. They got Toledo on the road, Ball State at home, and Kent State on the road. That last game, the Kent State on the road, is crucial for the Zips, mainly because according to how these quads work, a quad 1 win denotes that you either beat a team in the top 30 at home, beat a team in the top 50 on a neutral site, or beat a team in the top 75 on the road. Meaning, if Akron were to beat Kent State, that would count as a quad 1 win. Nobody in the MAC right now has a quad 1 win. So if we get to that point where Akron and Kent State are going at it, and maybe there's Toledo and Ball State are also fighting for that number 1 spot, Akron could very much get that number one seed. And you look at some of these other teams. Now, granted, when you look at the mid majors, there is a chance that a lot of these teams, the only teams that get in, I should say, are conference champions. But that being said, if you look at how Akron schedule is, they've got a tough schedule, but if they can win out, they get the number one seed. And even if they don't end up winning the championship, say they lose in the semifinals, or probably I'd say more of the case in the finals, they have a valid chance. They have a valid case to make it in as an at-large bid. And I would say for the Zips as well, I would be on that train for sure in terms of getting them that coveted at-large bid. All right, so we're done with basketball. Talked about Xavier, talked about Ohio State, talked about some good old Maction for you guys. I know a lot of you guys will appreciate it knowing that you guys go to Mac schools. Now it's time to look at hockey. So let's do that hockey right here on Buckeye Sports Breakdown. And we're focusing on the Columbus Blue Jackets, who, as I said at the top of the show, will be at Mullet Arena right here in Phoenix this Sunday at 6:30 as they take on the Arizona Coyotes. They will play the Dallas Stars at 6 Eastern tonight. Blue Jackets, surprisingly, despite this year, which has been all but impressive, 38 points, dead last, that too by 12 points in the East, and dead last overall, or actually I should pull that up. I don't think they're dead last overall in the NHL, but they are definitely towards the bottom. Second to last, Chicago Blackhawks are the only team worse in that league. But you get my point. That being said, since the All-Star break, Columbus has played pretty decent in that regards. And when I say decent, I mean decent for a reasonable team, which is AKA good for them. Beat the Maple Leafs on the road in Toronto 4-3, and then beat the Winnipeg Jets 3-1 in Columbus. These are big wins. Now, the Maple Leafs was off a return leg, and that too, the first game with the Maple Leafs in that series, they ended up playing the day before in Columbus. They lost 3-0. So you could almost say this was almost like a series win per se, if this were like a playoff type series. But the Jets win is pretty impressive from my standpoint, that they are currently second in the Central, destined to be a playoff team this year. Same goes to Toronto as well, as they're second in the Atlantic Division. Big game tonight as well, as they face Dallas, who's currently first in the Central. It gives the Columbus a chance to at least gain some momentum overall. You know, you got some personnel on the ice. It's anybody's game. I think I was looking at stats last night, and I have to give some shout outs to Columbus's line. Despite Johnny Gaudreau making so much noise over the summer for Columbus, I've been impressed by how these different lines and kind of the different players overall for Columbus have contributed throughout their time. I look at their schedule, especially in their game against Winnipeg. You had Gaudreau only bagging an assist. Boone Jenner, kind of a stalwart in Columbus throughout the years, bagging a goal. Ken Johnson with a goal. Emil Bemstrom with an assist. Bukovic, and then, as I mentioned, Gaudreau. Patrick Lane, the former Edmonton Oiler, also bagged a goal and assist. So again, or pardon me, Patrick Lane ended up playing for the Jets. I knew he played for a Canadian team, but just had to check. Yeah, so my apologies. He did play for the Jets. But still, my point exactly on how Columbus has played. They brought in these different types of players, and they're starting to work as a cohesive unit overall. And again, to my point, as I said earlier, in hockey, that's what you need. You don't want to just rely heavily on your first line. You need the second and third line to be as important as the others, right? That's what Colorado does so well. That's why the Lightning have been so good. That's why they made 3 consecutive Stanley Cup finals. And Columbus is starting to come into themselves in that regards as well. So let's take a look at this road stretch, and more specifically, how they could be going down. I talked about the lines. Same goes tonight against the Stars of Dallas. Dallas has always had a good mix of defenders. So I think, in my opinion, you need those lines to kind of wear down the defense and potentially get those goals. Now, let's take a look at the game on Sunday. If you're wondering, I will unfortunately not be going to that game. I have acquired concert then. Plus, tickets are super expensive. So whoever's in charge of Coyotes U, y'all got to drop the prices. $50 for Blue Jackets. I know they're getting good, but seriously, $50 for a ticket? Come on, guys. Anyhow, enough of my rant on ticket prices. I know I'm a college student. I have a right to say that. But either way, the Coyotes currently have 46 points, tied for fourth last in the West. They're going to have to pull off a miracle if they are to make the playoffs. I mean, in a lack of better terms, this is mid against mid right here at Mullet again. And Mullet Arena, I've seen this from commentators. I've seen this from people who call ASU games, many of which go here to Cronkite, which is where I'm recording this right now. Mullet Arena is a different environment. In the case that it is more of a college hockey arena than it is NHL. And I have to give credit on how that stadium and that arena in general has almost resurrected ASU's love for hockey. Not too much at Oceanside Ice Arena up the road, but so much electricity in that building. Almost every time ASU hockey plays, it's a sold out game. And that too, I might add, there's at least 5,000 people in those seats for games. That's a lot of people for a college hockey game, and it builds an electric atmosphere. For the Coyotes, I might be saying a little bit different. And granted, ASU has so many people from outside of the state of Arizona. And that's another thing that kind of contributes as such. They have such a big section where I believe there's like 400 to 500 students that get in for each game. At least it seems like it for NHL games. Correct me if I'm wrong. But you have hundreds of students, but so many jerseys in that regards. About 35% of ASU students are not from the state of Arizona. When you look at guys from Cronkite, aka people who have a major such as sports journalism, which is what I'm studying, there are more people from out of state, mainly because Cronkite is one of the best broadcasting and journalism schools in the nation. That being said, there's going to be a lot of people who are not Coyotes fans. And I get what the Coyotes are doing in their regards to kind of push hockey, but are they really pushing the love for the Coyotes, or are they just pushing hockey in general? And I think when it comes to how the Coyotes have played, I think that's a deciding factor, that you don't really get the electric atmosphere. Not that the Coyotes have had much of an electric atmosphere, even when they were at Gila River Arena in Glendale, but still, I think it really helps out Columbus in that regards, that despite it being more of a tight kind of environment, it's still going to be a little bit of a feeling out process. And again, it's not going to be anywhere close to Dallas or say trips to Toronto and Canada, where we've seen Columbus get some wins and hopefully put up some tough tests. So again, you look at the Coyotes, at least what they've done on paper, 2 consecutive wins, and they did beat the reigning Eastern Conference champs, Tampa Bay Lightning, who did have a full squad, at least in the offensive side. Their goalkeeper, Andrei Vasilevsky, was not playing, but the Coyotes won 1-0 in a shootout. So we have seen the Coyotes show up on the defensive side this year. So that's going to be a big point of access and a big point of attacking in that regards for Columbus if they are to pull off a win. And I think also matching them on the defensive side, it almost feels like when the Coyotes get a goal, that's when the crowd starts to get into the game. And they've pulled some pretty interesting upsets so far, and Mullet Arena has started to kind of work in their favor. That being said, I actually think the Blue Jackets pull it off. Give me Columbus to win this 2-1 at Mullet Arena. It's going to be this Sunday at 6:30 p.m. If not, well, we're going to have a pretty cool tweet coming from Mallory Schnell, Cronkite student, actually the director for Blaze Sports right here in Cronkite. So shout out to her. She's working with the Coyotes as a social media manager this semester. So maybe we see a cool tweet from her. I don't know how she would incorporate the Blue Jackets into a roasting tweet, but hey, let's see. If not, we'll take the Blue Jackets dub in the end. So that wraps up this episode of Buckeye Sports Breakdown. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Mahirson Hassan, and I'll see you next week.